in retrospect, when I look back from where we were 2-3 years ago, from where the movement was in 2014, while it's very encouraging after Navdeep Singh Johar judgment that many employers, mostly in the private sector, splashed their logos into rainbow colors. It would have been often Grace and Grace raised this first. It would have been very encouraging to see those employers splash into the trans flag colors after Nalsa, which just did not happen. And it was just a grim reminder that successes, be they big or small, that the trans communities and trans people we achieve they're not responded to with the same level of involvement and engagement that a very powerful private sector does with regard to the 377 judgment. But all is not lost, and there is a lot of work to be done. I will focus primarily on intersectional solidarities from other movements. As trans people, as trans persons, trans women, many of us identify as women, although there are some of our friends who don't necessarily identify as women and may locate themselves at many points on the continuum. The place where we stand, wherever we stand today, we don't stand all by ourselves. We stand not just all by ourselves. Of course, we stand as people, but we stand where we stand because of the many struggles that our mothers, sisters, fathers, friends included, fought ahead of us. We stand where we stand today because of a Mathura judgment of 1980, which and the backlash that ensued thereafter on how women who suffer sexual assault and violence are put through greater structural monstrosities in the justice system. We stand where we are today because of the shoulders that the women's rights activists, the women's rights movements, the gender equality movements, and the disability rights movement and our friends there gave us. They gave us their shoulders for us to stand on them and see from a height that wasn't available to us. The queer rights movement, the trans rights movement borrows and draws in heavily from the gender equality movements, the anti-caste movement. The Constitution and the framers of our Constitution, I dislike the word founding fathers because it talks about fathers and not parents. So the framers of our Constitution were able to envisage caste as a structural monstrosity, were able to analyze and recognize the need for gender equality, but at that point of time, there is no word in the Constitution there's no word as sexuality or sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. Sex is the word used. So, despite which we have a constitution that's broad enough to rise to the unforeseen challenges of the future. And from the gender equality movements, from judgments that were delivered over the past few decades, be it the Mathura case or the Vishaka judgment, Vishaka guidelines, or the implementation of Vishaka that Professor Dr. Medha Kotwal Lele filed for its implementation, we have a lot to derive. Now, I'll go one by one, and beginning with the gender equality movements. Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act 2013, that took 17 years after 1996 when Vishaka was delivered. The Parliament took 17 years to awaken from deep slumber and enact a comprehensive legislation. What doesn't clearly include intersex or transgender people who identify as women. And many transgender people, as you'd be aware, are structurally excluded from the process of employment. The process of employment, which requires people to undergo rounds of interviews, could be a very radioactive space that encourages sexual harassment. We have enough and more cases where candidates who are not necessarily employees, because they're not part of the system yet, they are interviewees and they are not employees yet. And when we go to apply for jobs and we undergo so many processes, the organizational policy doesn't necessarily apply to us because we are not employees defined under law. What if, and there are many cases where employers across sectors have sexually harassed, have asked people questions. I've been asked a question, like, so what do you do for a living? This is not a question that a transgender person dependent on traditional sources of livelihood would be comfortable answering, because the honest answer to that question would be, I do sex work for my living. And I know what the what the result of such an honest answer would be. Well, I try to dodge that question with something like, I'm dependent on traditional sources of transgender livelihood. I tried being as vague as I could. But how does the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act offer protections to transgender candidates who are not employees yet? Are organizational policies covering these? For a person who's going to apply for a job, that person is in a very high level of stress. Now, there are transgender people, and myself included, where a person who's shaken hands with me has shaken hands in such a suggestive way that he's almost scratched my palm. Now, I am about to write an exam. Would I be thinking about the finger that scratched my palm, or would I be thinking about, oh my God, I have this exam to write, I have so many written tests to clear, and I have an interview to crack? It's almost like an exam. So there are inadequacies in the law that we must address. Domestic Violence Act, for those trans people who identify as women who are not, who don't have a marriage certificate, because the registrar of marriages doesn't by default recognize, the law doesn't by default recognize trans marriages if people show as transgender not as female on cards. How do we access the Domestic Violence Act? Because there is intimate partner violence, and people often are murdered and put to death or are driven to suicide. Section 375 and 6 don't apply to trans people. In fact, on the contrary, the way we've leveraged the law is not through these statutes meant to offer protection to women against sexual assault, but through other laws like Prevention of SC/ST Atrocities Act. A case of, I have just 7 more minutes left, so I'm trying to be mindful of my time. A certain case where sexual assault, 2 trans women were sexually assaulted by a dominant caste business community, and they were expletives, unmentionable expletives were used, but these 2 women did not know Hindi. They were from interior Andhra and interior Telengana. They don't speak Urdu or Hindi. So when they were called Chamar Chinal, they didn't understand what Chamar Chinal means. Chamar Chinal is a casteist expletive that calls a woman of a certain repressed caste a prostitute. So, and by the time they figured out, and people remember only the top 5 or top 3 things when they go through a traumatic experience like that. And it was only the 2nd or the 3rd day where they asked, what does Chamar Chinal mean? And we were able to include that only 2 or 3 days later, which wasn't taken to very kindly by the SHO and the investigating officer. They said that you're trying to construct a case for Prevention of SC/ST Atrocities Act, and this clearly happened 3 years ago, well before the Dr. Subhash Nath Kashinath Mahajan versus State of Maharashtra judgment of the Supreme Court that diluted the Prevention of Atrocities Act. Even then, it was quite a headache for trans people who are Dalit to leverage the Prevention of Atrocities Act. The police establishment across states, and clearly in my state, because I live there, is very well calibrated to water down prevention of atrocities cases. They say things like, Daroga saab nahi hai, sham ko aao. SI saab nahi hai, kal aao. And this goes on for 2 or 3 days. And when the person insists on getting it registered, and we've used many techniques, like we've sent complaints by reg post, by email, because all police stations are online right now, and stuck the complaint on the wall of the police station and taken a photograph with the newspaper so that this is the date on which we gave the complaint. When we do all that, then the police uses another strategy. They say, acha, register kar lenge, but dekho, you are living with the assailants, they're your neighbors, what if they kill you? So think through this. You know, we're worried about yourself. They don't say that we'll give you protection. So in a way, as though they wish to protect us, transgender people, they actually try to arm twist and discourage people from complaining. Because it's about intersectional solidarities, I'm required to speak about that. The fact that the Kashinath Mahajan judgment that subverted and circumvented the Prevention of Atrocities Act met with massive resistance from our Dalit friends, brothers and sisters, that forced the parliament to amend the law. Now, we need to learn lessons out of it. There are certain horizontals that we need to pick up, because across the anti-caste, gender equality, disability rights movements, there are certain horizontals running vertically. And one such horizontal is resistance, and unified resistance, collective resistance. They've been successful because they've been recognized as a constituency, and at that point of time, the general elections, the Lok Sabha elections were around the corner. But now we are not at that phase. How do we ensure that if the transgender bill were to get passed, or even before the passage of the transgender bill, we engage enough with the members of the Rajya Sabha, because now the Lok Sabha members of parliament do not matter. It's been passed already. We need to focus our efforts with the members of parliament, the 240 or 45 members of parliament in the Rajya Sabha, to ensure that we tinker or majorly, radically change if possible, or what is the strategy if it gets passed, and challenge it in the Supreme Court and so on. So these are horizontals that we need to pick, and perhaps low-hanging fruits, because these are battles fought already. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. On the hashtag MeToo movement, while we've heard a lot of testimonies from women and also men, we've barely heard any testimonies from trans people, primarily also because trans people have been excluded majorly from employment. Much of the testimonies that I heard were were very few in terms of how trans people were sexually harassed at workplace, because very few trans people have accessed employment. Many were also about how during the process to get hired, they were sexually harassed, and how it becomes very difficult during the recruitment process to allege that the employer has been a sexual harasser, because it could be suicidal. And not all employers are large multinational corporations. There are proprietary firms where they don't have human resources, where they don't have ombudspersons and so on, and where it could become suicidal to allege that one has been sexually harassed. Triple Talaq Bill and the resistance of our Muslim friends, brothers, sisters, friends, and women, because we have Muslim feminists some of who have offered limited support to the bill, where it's not blanket, where many of us have heard our Muslim feminist friends be okay with the Supreme Court judgment that set aside triple talaq, talaq-e-biddat, while when it was taken to another level of criminalization of triple talaq was when many of them said, but we want triple talaq-e-biddat to be illegalized, that's good, but we don't want our brothers' husbands to go to jail, because husband who's gone to jail will come back and continue the family. It shatters the family, it breaks the family. So these are concerns that we must bear in mind. And I don't have a definite viewpoint here because it's not entirely my space. I'm not born into a Muslim family. So I'm trying to understand it as a diversity of views. There is no one view here, nor are there two views. There is a whole diversity of views. And it reminds me of the Shabano judgment days 10 years ago. Shabano judgment, I mean the one that was delivered 30 years ago. And this was a discussion that, I forget that friend's name at ALF, Mankur, Aarti Mankur, right? So 5 years ago, she was talking about how Muslim women were encouraged to go to a regular court of law, and how they didn't publicize the fact that Muslim men, if they go to the Qazi once, can strip the Muslim woman from the choice or the option to go to a court of law, and will be forced to go to a Qazi. So they didn't publicize that because these were some loopholes in the law that should not be publicized for the benefit of Muslim women. So there are certain learnings that we need to learn out of this. When we talk of structural monstrosities within the community, within the transgender community, we need to look at the timing and the audience, because structural monstrosities within the trans communities are not things that I think I would want to talk to the press or to the government, because the state is a very different way of understanding it. So I'm trying to draw an analogy here, because although they're not alike, they're not identical. So we need to be careful and judiciously choose forums where we will self-correct, and communities should be open to organically self-correct than the law mandating something to the communities. Right to the next one that I'll talk about is right to education, and here I'd specifically focus on the draft education policy. It's vast, so I'll just limit myself to legal education. I was appalled and very disappointed to see the education policy on legal education that lays a focus on scriptural understanding of law. It uses the word mythology. So as trans people, as queer people, are we questioning the policy? Are we giving our feedback to the government of India, opposing it, encouraging it where we need to, and opposing it and offering alternatives? The next one that I will talk about is the rights of sex workers. We've had two judgments this year, one from the Bombay High Court, which is Asia Anwar Sheikh versus State of Maharashtra, and the other from the Calcutta High Court, which is Lakshmikant Mehti versus State of West Bengal. The first one was that it was not just about, simply put, it was not just about a no's a no's a no. This is an old principle. But in situations like sexual assault, where one is petrified and mortified, and situations where the survivor may just freeze and not even be able to say anything, the court upheld that only a yes is a yes is a yes. Because a no is a no is a no is a very old principle. Only the absence of a no does not mean a yes. The second one on Lakshmikant Mehti versus State of West Bengal, the court held that sex workers must not be forcibly sent to remand homes and rehabilitation centers. Here for the next 1 or 2 minutes, I'll focus on how in India we are almost cutting and copy-pasting the American model of raid and rescue. Although Padma Shri anti-trafficking activists are calling it some other model, it's not it's just a copy-paste of the US State Department's raid and rescue model. There are many other jurisprudential models in Netherlands, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Europe, and in many other countries. And what about devising and designing our own model that is local, that comes from within our lived realities and has the best of all the jurisprudential models across the world. The last bit that I'll speak of is on Article 370. I recently met a group of Kashmiri friends in Hyderabad. This was facilitated by some Muslim feminist friends, and it was heart-wrenching to hear from them that they have not been able to contact their families for the past one and a quarter months, since the first week of August. They mostly spoke about how it is in Kashmir now that collective responsibility, they use these words, I'm just quoting them, that if a person were to be found stone pelting, how the entire household is being questioned and households are being questioned. I'm not making a value judgment here. I'm not supporting or condemning the government of India, but what I'm trying to do is share with the audience the thrall in which many Kashmiri students live across India. These friends were from the University of Hyderabad and Maulana Abdul Kalam, Manu, as it's called in short. They said that we're unable to contact our parents. Our parents, we don't even know if they have Medicare. What do we learn out of these struggles that are going on at the same time? Please mind you, I'm not trying to make take a position that's either pro or anti-government of India, but all I'm trying to do is present to you what I've heard about the thrall and the subhuman conditions in which some of our friends are living across India, purely because they belong to a certain state, and perhaps purely because most of them belong to that state and belong to a certain religion. So what do we learn out of this? What is it that we can do to make better ourselves and our friends who are in similar thrall? Thank you.